We're going to start this deep dive with a question that, on the surface, seems pretty simple.
Right.
But the answer reveals some really profound and honestly kind of painful truths about us, about human psychology and money.
All right.
Why is it that so many people who get sudden, just astronomical wealth?
And we're talking athletes, lottery winners.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Musicians, entrepreneurs who have a big exit. Why do they so often lose it all just as quickly as they got it?
It's the ultimate financial paradox, isn't it? The statistics are just, they're brutal. You see these stories, right?
All the time.
This meteoric rise, this sudden access to what seems like, limitless money. And then this incredibly dramatic, painful fall.
Yeah, right into bankruptcy.
Right. And the public, they always jump to the easy answer. They'll say, oh, they were just careless, or maybe they can't do basic math.
Or they lacked discipline.
That's the one.
Yeah.
But the sources we dove into, especially the work of Dr. Brad Klontz, they tell a far more complex story. And a much more universal one, frankly.
Okay, let's unpack that right away, because Dr. Klontz's analysis,
Right.
it completely sidesteps the usual stuff, the spreadsheets and the budgets. It jumps right into the deep wiring of the human brain.
It does.
The core thesis here is just, it's devastatingly simple, but it's so powerful. The real issue isn't ignorance. It's not about interest rates or tax codes.
No.
It's unexamined psychology around money. These deep, ingrained emotional patterns, he calls them money scripts, that just take over when sudden wealth hits the system.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating is how it's all magnified. The dangerous patterns you see in a celebrity making $50 million. They're just bigger versions of the same struggles that affect everyday people.
No matter what they're earning.
Right. Sudden wealth, whether it's $50,000 from an inheritance or $100 million from an IPO, it acts like an acute stress test for your entire psychological framework.
And most of us fail that test.
Because we haven't trained for it.
Nobody
has.
So that's our mission today. We are going straight to the heart of this. We're drilling down into the 7 psychological traps that the research identifies. And the goal for you, listening, it's not really about preparing you to win the lottery. It's about understanding these traps so you can see your own money beliefs. And to make sure that if wealth comes, gradually or suddenly, it actually liberates you.
Instead of destroying you.
Right. This is the story of going from, as the sources say, food stamps to Ferraris, and how the mind often forces that journey to end right back where it started.
So to start, let's look outward at the immediate, just overwhelming pressure that comes from that kind of status shift. The unrealistic expectations wealth creates. These external forces are the basis of our first 2 traps.
Let's do it. Trap number 1, the illusion that the money will never stop. I find this one so dangerous because it plays right into our natural optimism.
And maybe a little bit of arrogance.
A little bit, yeah. When the money is just flowing, a huge signing bonus, stock options vesting, there's this immediate, really tempting assumption that this is the new normal.
That is permanent.
Yes.
And that assumption, it's a cognitive shortcut. It's called recency bias. Because your last few years have been filled with this incredible success, your brain just automatically assumes this trajectory will continue forever.
Right. It completely distorts reality.
It does. Your reality about career length, about stability, it's the psychological version of looking at the stock market during a huge bull run and just assuming it's going to go up 20% every year forever.
But the truth, especially in these high-profile fields like pro sports, is the complete opposite.
It is.
And the sources give us some incredibly stark, cold numbers on this that just, they shatter that illusion.
They should be required reading for every rookie.
Seriously. It should be etched onto the signing bonus check.
Yeah, because while we all see the Tom Bradys, the LeBrons, the superstars with these 20-year careers, the reality for most players is brutally short.
So what are the actual numbers?
The sources highlight that the average NFL career, for instance, lasts only about 3.3 years.
3.3 years. That is terrifying.
It is. The NBA average is a little longer, maybe 4.5 years.
Yeah.
But think about that. You have, maybe 5 years, often less, to earn all the money you will ever make in your primary career.
So if you get a $10 million signing bonus, you have to realize that money needs to last you until you're 80 or 90.
Exactly. But if you're out there spending, you have 20 more years of that same income ahead of you.
You're setting yourself up for an immediate catastrophic failure. The second that income stops, it's over.
Their spending is built for compounding income, but their reality is a one-time lump sum that they need to treat like an endowment.
And this isn't just a sports problem, is it? The sources draw a parallel to the music industry.
Oh, it's a perfect parallel, especially with what the material calls one-hit wonders. They get this brief period of massive fame, huge income from one song, maybe a short tour.
But they often never see those kinds of royalties again.
Right. The next album flops. But during that one peak year, they immediately inflate their entire lifestyle. They buy the mansion, lease 3 luxury cars.
Oh, the entourage. That's a huge one.
The entourage is a massive liability. It's a fixed payroll of people they suddenly feel responsible for.
So you've created this huge fixed cost structure that's designed for a fantasy income.
Precisely. You have these massive overheads. The mortgage, the maintenance, the insurance on the cars, the salaries for 10 friends you put on the payroll, and then the music stops. The contract isn't renewed.
The income stream slams to a halt, but the $150,000 a month in expenses, that doesn't slow down at all.
And it takes a surprisingly short amount of time for that spending to just burn right through the principal, the very money they should have been protecting.
Which leads directly to financial collapse. It all starts with that failure to internalize that one cold, hard fact: this is temporary.
And very often what pushes them into that unsustainable spending in the first place is our second trap, which is so driven by social dynamics.
Right, financial peer pressure.
Yeah. Trap is just, it's fueled by that primal human need to belong, and it's so insidious because it's all about comparison.
It is. The sources talk about athletes earning the league minimum, which, is still a great salary for a normal person.
Of course.
But they feel compelled to mimic the spending of teammates who have these $100 million contracts.
They're living in a completely distorted financial reality.
Totally. If you're making $500,000 a year and the guy in the locker next to you is making $30 million, he can afford the private jet. He can afford the hypercar.
You objectively cannot.
You cannot. But you want to fit in. You want to be seen as part of the team. And that means getting the same status symbols. You feel like you can't be the one driving a Ford F-150 into a parking lot full of Ferraris and Bentleys.
That drive right there, overspending just to match the image of a richer group, that is the very definition of financial peer pressure. It's just an unsustainable attempt to buy your way into social alignment. And what makes it so much more dangerous, and the sources really emphasize this, is how it gets magnified for people who come from real deep poverty.
That's the key emotional layer, isn't it? For someone who grew up with true scarcity, the pressure to keep up appearances isn't just about vanity.
No, it's much deeper.
It's magnified by this profound emotional need to prove to the world, but mostly to themselves, that they have truly escaped their past.
If they stop driving the fancy car or sell the big house, they feel subconsciously that they're at risk of being pulled right back into that struggle they just escaped.
So the psychological twist is that for them, status becomes a survival mechanism.
Exactly. It gets completely divorced from any sound financial strategy. They
Yeah.
feel like they have to wear their success, drive their success, live in their success, or it wasn't real in the first place.
It's not just overcompensation, it's like a frantic defense mechanism.
Right.
The need to belong, to project this financial invincibility to their old neighborhood. It just overrides any sensible budget. They're using million-dollar decisions to soothe these deep internal emotional wounds, and that's never sustainable.
And that's the thing about these external pressures. They're powerful, but they're only half the equation. Now we have to go inward to the deeper internal stuff, the subconscious self-sabotage that's programmed into us long before the money ever shows up.
This is where things get really sticky, and this brings us to trap number 3, the financial comfort zone. If you take one concept away from this entire deep dive, this should probably be it.
I agree. It's crucial to understanding why people unconsciously just throw away fortunes.
So what is it exactly?
It's all about this idea of a financial comfort zone, or as the sources call it, which I love, a financial thermostat.
The thermostat, okay?
Every single person has one. And it gets set very early in life, usually by the time you're 10. If you grew up with financial scarcity, your thermostat might be set at, say, $50,000 a year.
Or middle class, maybe $150,000.
Exactly. And that setting dictates your internal subconscious idea of what is normal or safe financially.
And the problem is, if your thermostat is set to 50 grand and you suddenly get 5 million,
Your whole system short circuits. The habits and the mental patterns that helped you survive when you were poor, being hyper aware of every dollar, maybe living with constant financial anxiety, those are the very same patterns that now sabotage prosperity.
your internal operating system just isn't built to handle millions.
Right. The jump from a 5-figure comfort zone to a 7-figure reality creates this profound psychological dissonance. It feels like stress, not freedom. And this stress triggers something Dr. Klontz identifies as tribal anxiety.
Tribal anxiety. Let's really dig into what that means today in a financial context.
It's a subconscious fear of losing your connection to your original social group.
To your tribe.
To your tribe. If you came from a working-class neighborhood and you suddenly have all this conspicuous wealth, the fleet of cars, the gated community, you could feel like an alien to your own family, to your own friends.
And the subconscious mind reads that social isolation as a threat.
A huge threat. A bigger threat than losing the money.
That makes perfect evolutionary sense. The sources connect this back to, for millennia, being separated from your tribe meant you were alone. It meant death.
And even though we're not facing starvation today, that ancient alarm bell still rings loud and clear when we feel disconnected or rejected by the people who matter most to us.
So how does this fear show up in their financial behavior?
In two really powerful self-sabotaging ways. First, the person subconsciously tries to get back to normal by just spending the money down to their comfort zone. And second, they use the money to try and buy their way back into the tribe's good graces.
Through just reckless generosity.
Reckless generosity. They give it away, they fund parties, make loans they know they'll never get back. They're essentially trying to calm the tribe down, saying, see, I'm not keeping it all. I'm still one of you.
They're literally sacrificing their fortune to feel like they belong. And the perfect example of this in action has to be lottery winners.
The statistics are horrifying, and they just underscore this point perfectly. Studies show that a huge majority of lottery winners are back to financial ruin within 5 years.
5 years? Why?
Because their identity didn't evolve with their income. They won the money, but they didn't change who they were or what they believed about themselves. They were still the person whose thermostat was set to $40,000 a year.
And their subconscious behavior just dragged their net worth right back down to match their self-perception.
Exactly. It's powerful proof that your financial success will almost never exceed your subconscious self-perception. You can't out-earn your own money scripts.
And speaking of identity, that brings us to a related trap. We're jumping ahead to trap number 7 because it's a direct consequence of this identity crisis.
Right. This is confusing self-worth with net worth.
This is the one that causes the most emotional damage. When fame and money arrive that quickly, a person's identity can fuse completely with their financial status.
So they stop being a person who has wealth.
And they become a rich person. Their value as a human being becomes inseparable from the size of their bank account.
So those luxury items, the plane, the watches, the huge house, they're not just assets anymore.
No, they become literal physical symbols of personal value. They're status markers that are constantly screaming, I am important, I am valuable, I matter.
They are external proof of internal significance.
Perfectly put. The problem is that wealth, especially from something like sports or music, is volatile. It's temporary. And when the money slows down, which we've already established, is the reality for most.
It triggers what the source calls the double collapse.
Yes.
Okay, what is a double collapse? That sounds devastating.
It is. It's a financial collapse and a personal existential collapse happening at the same time.
When the income dries up, they don't just lose money. They experience a profound, instant loss of identity. Their financial status collapses. And because their self-worth was tied to it, their self-worth collapses right alongside it.
And that leads to what?
Depression?
Deep depression, desperation, and these incredibly reckless financial decisions made in a frantic attempt to just feel important again.
They need to get those symbols of value back.
Because without them, they feel completely worthless.
I can see how that would just compound the errors. A person in that state is not thinking clearly. They're probably taking huge risks, borrowing money, all just to get that rush of cash that makes them feel like their old self again. And that's where the source material offers its most powerful solution. Dr. Klontz makes it clear that true financial well-being has to be rooted in a self-esteem that is totally independent of your wealth.
You have to decouple your sense of self from your net worth.
You have to. If you genuinely believe your self-worth is $10 million, what happens when the market takes $9 million of it away?
You feel like you've lost 90% of yourself.
Exactly. And that's terrifying psychological burden to carry. It explains so much of the desperation we see.
That's a perfect bridge. We've looked at the internal wiring, the identity fusion. Now let's look at how that sudden wealth just violently reshapes the relationships around them. Which brings us to trap 4.
Yes.
This might be the most emotionally draining one. Family, friends, and emotional blackmail.
This is the moment the newly wealthy person is instantly promoted to unsolicited financial savior of their entire community.
It's an immediate and often really aggressive expectation, isn't it?
Absolutely. Suddenly, you're the one fielding requests for everything. Help with bills, new cars, down payments, college tuition, weddings, bail money, you name it.
And the person, they're often driven by this intense loyalty, maybe some guilt, and that tribal anxiety we just talked about, that fear of being cast out.
Yeah, so they find it almost impossible to say no. They feel responsible, obligated even, to lift up everyone they came up with.
The problem isn't the generosity, though, it's the lack of boundaries.
And creating a precedent you can never undo. The sources tell that classic story about Charles Barkley.
Oh, right. The advice he got.
Yeah, early in his career, Grant Hill's mother gave him this critical piece of advice. She told him point blank not to start financially supporting everyone in his network because, and this is the key part, once you start, they'll never stop.
That is so insightful because it highlights that the dynamic has fundamentally changed. You're not just a family member anymore. You're a resource.
You're the bank. And once you establish yourself as the bank, you can never go back to just being a son or a brother or a friend. It's a permanent and financially devastating expectation.
And this leads to the cost of setting those boundaries. The material says when Barkley finally did put his foot down,
It damaged a lot of relationships. He lost friends over it.
which just proves that painful truth. Saying no isn't selfish, it's necessary. It's necessary for your wealth to last and for your own sanity.
And for the people who can't set those boundaries, who are constantly giving money away out of guilt or fear of rejection,
They bleed their wealth slowly. It's not one big scam that takes them down.
no, it's described perfectly as losing your money through 1,000 small cuts.
Death by 1,000 paper cuts.
It's the cumulative effect of this constant low-level financial drain that's driven purely by emotion. And it brings us to this really harsh equation from the research. Financial empathy without clear, firm boundaries leads to destruction.
The destruction of the wealth and often the person holding it.
Right. You can't save everyone without drowning yourself.
Which takes us from that really emotional inner circle of friends and family to the professional circle. Trap number 5, mistrust of financial professionals.
This is such a logical extension of the financial comfort zone we talked about. If you come from a place where you had no exposure to trustworthy financial advisors.
Or worse, your community's only experience with finance was like predatory lending.
Exactly. Then the stories you carry with you are all about fraud and exploitation.
So when you suddenly have millions, you don't see a potential partner, a tax planner, an estate attorney. You see a shark who's trying to steal your money.
Precisely. It leads to this dangerous all-or-nothing mindset. The person either relies on totally unqualified relatives or friends, people they feel they can trust, but who have zero experience,
Or they try to do it all themselves.
which the sources call financial isolation. This profound, dangerous belief that the safest way to handle your fortune is to just keep everyone away from it.
And this is where the material draws that sharp contrast between the mindset of the newly wealthy and the, old money.
That mindset comparison is absolutely critical. You see the poor mindset at work, which says, I could do this myself. I don't trust outsiders.
Which might be a fine survival skill when you're dealing with thousands of dollars.
Right, but it is completely inadequate when you're dealing with complex tax laws, trusts, estate planning, multi-asset investing. That mindset just doesn't scale to 8 figures.
And you compare that to the rich mindset, which is basically built on the principle of,
I need a team. They understand that professional help isn't an expense. It's a vital form of protection and optimization.
it's a failure to delegate expertise. You wouldn't perform surgery on yourself.
Exactly. And yet people try to manage these incredibly complex financial structures alone because of distrust built on past experiences.
The sports analogy here is just so perfect. You're an expert at your sport, at your craft.
You are not by default an expert in asset protection or tax diversification. Just as an athlete needs a coach and a team of trainers, you absolutely need professional guidance to manage significant wealth.
Your talent as a quarterback doesn't qualify you to navigate international investing.
Not at all. And that failure to recognize the limits of your own expertise brings us right to our final operational trap, trap number 6.
Overconfidence bias. The Midas touch trap.
This is maybe the most predictable trap of all. When you achieve massive world-class success in one very specific area, sports, music, software, it can breed this incredible overconfidence in totally unrelated fields.
You internalize this belief that you are uniquely gifted, that you have this magic touch that will work everywhere you apply it.
Yeah. You completely assume that your talent or your luck will just automatically translate into success in, say, running a restaurant or investing in startups, fields that require totally different skills. You believe you have a Midas touch and simply can't fail.
That's a textbook case of overconfidence bias, overestimating your abilities outside your actual area of expertise. And the sources list the classic, often catastrophic ventures this leads to.
Oh yeah, opening super expensive restaurants they never check the books on, starting vanity record labels with no business plan, launching clothing lines that flop immediately.
We're just throwing money at startups pitched by friends with zero due diligence.
The common denominator is always a rapid financial hemorrhage. And the irony, when you think about how they got successful in the first place, is just painful.
The research really hammers that point home.
It does. Their original success in sports or music was built on decades of brutal work, intense discipline, specialized coaching. They didn't become world-class overnight.
But they expect instant mastery in these new fields. They think they can skip the education, skip the strategists, skip hiring a team, just because they have a big bank account.
They expect money and fame to be a substitute for knowledge and discipline,
And the businesses fail, often spectacularly.
proving that ultimate cold truth of this trap. Money doesn't care how famous you are. The laws of business are unforgiving. They apply to a world champion and the average person equally. Money is a tool, not a qualification.
That brings us full circle. We've gone from the external pressures down into the internal wiring of identity and through the relationship dynamics of family and professional health.
It's a lot to navigate.
So when we look at all 7 of these traps together, it's not just a list of mistakes. It paints this really cohesive, powerful psychological story.
Yeah, the sources summarize it so well. Most people who go broke after getting rich aren't unintelligent. They are simply untrained in the psychological demands of managing millions.
That is the critical distinction. Sudden wealth acts like a psychological earthquake.
That's a great way to put it. It violently shakes your identity, it disrupts all your core relationships, and it triggers these deep-seated, often destructive behaviors that were set in stone decades ago.
The money isn't the problem. The unprepared mind is the vulnerability.
And without the right tools, the right mindset, the right mentorship, that surge of wealth can absolutely destroy a person instead of liberating them. It becomes a burden, not a blessing.
So the core takeaway that we want you to leave with is this. Wealth management, at the end of the day, isn't about intelligence or market timing. It's about profound self-awareness.
The numbers in your bank account will only ever reflect the quality of your own self-management and your psychological health.
So let's synthesize this down into 5 universal principles from the sources. These are the practical antidotes to the traps we discussed, and they apply whether you're getting a bonus at work or selling a company for millions.
Okay, first, be realistic about income cycles. You have to counter that illusion that the money will never stop with a sober, clear-eyed look at the temporary nature of these high-income phases.
Base your lifestyle on sustainable income, not peak income.
Exactly.
Second, avoid financial peer pressure. Your financial health has to be totally separate from the expectations of the people around you. Don't sacrifice your future security for how you look today.
Third, and this is maybe the hardest one, set emotional and financial boundaries, especially with loved ones. Remember that saying no isn't selfish. It's an act of self-preservation. You have to protect yourself from those 1,000 small cuts.
Fourth, build a trusted team. Reject that financial isolation, that I can do it myself mindset. Millions of dollars require professional management. Lawyers, accountants, advisors. Find expertise you can verify and trust.
And finally, the most foundational one for your well-being. Keep your identity separate from your bank account. Your true self-worth has to be rooted in something that can't be lost in a bad market or taken away by a failed business. That is the only real antidote to confusing self-worth with net worth.
Dr. Klontz leaves us with this one provocative thought that really challenges the nature of financial struggle, no matter what your income is. He says, and I think this is profound, you can't outrun your beliefs, but you can rewire them.
And that's the challenge we want to leave you with. You can't just budget your way past these deep subconscious financial scripts that were formed when you were a kid. Those stories dictate every major financial move you make.
So the necessary first step.
The necessary first step toward any kind of lasting financial health, whether you have sudden wealth or you're building it slowly, is to start exploring those money scripts. What stories do you tell yourself about money? What is your financial thermostat set to? Understanding that initial script, that's the key to finally achieving real financial freedom.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we're confronting one of the most, well, tragic and common outcomes of success, the rapid loss of sudden wealth. We all know the stories. The athletes, musicians, the lottery winners who get these immense fortunes only to, return to financial ruin in just a handful of years.
And this pattern of collapse is endemic, and the source material we're looking at, it doesn't attribute it to simple ignorance. It really defines the problem as a deep failure rooted in unexamined psychology around money, a profound lack of wealth wisdom, as they call it. It's an issue that impacts people from every background, but it's especially acute when the money comes in fast and in, an overwhelming amount.
That's right. And so the core tension we really need to explore today is, what's the primary mechanism of this catastrophic loss? Is the dissipation of sudden wealth fundamentally driven by these deep-seated internal psychological structures? The subconscious self-sabotage that comes from fixed money scripts and an identity that just fails to adapt? I'm going to argue that the fundamental self-destructive driver is internal.
And I believe we have to look outward. While those internal scripts certainly provide fertile ground for failure, the actual mechanism by which the money disappears, that's driven by immediate, overwhelming external pressures. We're talking about the lack of structural boundaries, the relentless drain from what the material calls emotional blackmail, and the failure to build a professional team. To me, the external forces are the most potent and destructive elements that drain those accounts right down to zero.
So let's start with what I believe is the true point of failure, the individual's internal thermostat, which the material terms the financial comfort zone. This trap is just incredibly difficult to overcome because sudden wealth triggers this profound psychological dissonance.
Okay, but how does that dissonance, how does it actually translate into the physical loss of assets?
Well, it's a kind of mechanism of self-correction. So if a person grew up subconsciously believing that, say, $50,000 was the natural limit of their financial reality, then having $5 million in the bank just triggers an alarm system. The subconscious mind views that $5 million not as freedom, but as a stressful, dangerous anomaly, a position that exposes them to judgment or separation. So to eliminate that stress, the individual will unconsciously self-sabotage, engaging in reckless spending or bad investments, purely to get back to that familiar, psychologically safe zone.
And you're linking this directly back to identity?
Absolutely. This whole behavior is fueled by what's called tribal anxiety, this primal fear of losing connection with your original social group. If your identity is fused with your community, sudden wealth forces you out of that identity. The wealth is then torn down, sometimes aggressively, because the desire to stay connected to the tribe outweighs the desire for prosperity. The material confirms this with statistics on lottery winners. So many of them return to financial ruin within 5 years. Why? Because their identity didn't evolve with their income. And the deepest internal trap, then, is this confusing self-worth with net worth. When that income stream slows down, self-worth just collapses, which triggers panicked, reckless decisions just to regain that feeling of importance. So ultimately, lasting freedom requires that difficult internal work of rewiring these deep-seated money scripts. This proves, to me, that the internal landscape dictates the financial outcome.
That internal framework certainly explains the vulnerability, I'll grant you that. But it doesn't adequately explain the speed of the loss. The assets often vanish within months, not years. And that kind of velocity points directly toward immediate structural threats that operate regardless of one's long-term identity work.
Such as?
Well, the first and fastest drain is financial peer pressure, and it's often made worse by the nature of professional contracts. The source material highlights that athletes earning the league minimum, for instance, they often feel compelled to mimic the spending of teammates on a $100 million contract just to maintain status, just to function in the locker room and the social hierarchy. For people from backgrounds of scarcity, this isn't just keeping up with the Joneses, it's more like a survival mechanism magnified by their history. Status becomes non-negotiable, and the structural expectation of spending just quickly bleeds their resources.
But that sounds like a boundary issue, which is still rooted in the individual's inability to withstand that external pressure.
I see that perspective, but consider the most painful trap: family, friends, and emotional blackmail. When someone gets sudden wealth, they instantly become the expected financial savior for their entire community. Parents, siblings, cousins, old neighbors. The demands are constant and structurally overwhelming, and the people who lack that external defense mechanism, the ability to establish firm, enforceable boundaries, they bleed their wealth through what the material calls 1,000 small cuts.
You're referencing that necessary, though painful advice given to people like Charles Barkley. Once you start financially supporting everyone, the drain becomes impossible to stop.
Exactly. And that anecdote, it just demonstrates the devastating power of these external demands. The toxic combination of financial empathy without boundaries is destructive. The individuals placed in this impossible structural position choose between financial ruin or face painful guilt, rejection, and potential family breakdown. And this is all compounded by the structural failure to build a defense, the mistrust of financial professionals, a lifetime conditioned by a poor mindset, I can do this myself, those professionals are untrustworthy. It prevents them from adopting the essential rich mindset, which is, I need a trusted team. This structural deficit invites inevitable and swift failure, regardless of what their underlying self-worth looks like. So my primary challenge to your position is really centered on the practical flow of funds. If the money is disappearing primarily through these structural drains, family demands, con artists, bad real estate deals that are enabled by a lack of oversight, how can you prioritize the internal financial comfort zone as the fundamental cause? The money is often liquidated entirely and swiftly before any of that deep internal identity work has even had a chance to begin, let alone finish. The mechanism of failure seems purely operational.
I see why you emphasize the transactional velocity of the loss. I do. But I would argue that the external pressures you're describing, the peer pressure, the emotional blackmail, they're merely opportunities for these deep-seated psychological traps to manifest. The external drain is successful precisely because the internal identity is insecure and resistant to the new reality. If the identity were robust, if it had successfully evolved, then setting boundaries against that emotional blackmail would be difficult. Yes, but it would be fundamentally possible.
But setting boundaries is a learned structural skill. It's not purely an internal revelation.
Well, the inability to say no, which is what precipitates the loss, is the manifestation of self-sabotage, and it stems from the desire to avoid that tribal anxiety. The individual literally risks millions of dollars just to retain a sense of psychological safety within their original social structure. The internal failure is the necessary precondition for the external mechanism to succeed. If that internal thermostat hasn't been recalibrated, they will either passively or actively invite the external pressures in to solve their dissonance by just reducing their net worth.
That's a compelling psychological framework, I'll admit, though I would frame the relationship between the two forces differently. While the root may stem from psychological resistance, the lethality of the situation is overwhelmingly structural. The threat isn't just internal self-sabotage. It's the inability to quickly build a trusted external defense mechanism. And this difficulty is structurally reinforced by their background. I mean, growing up in scarcity often means you have no frame of reference for or exposure to trustworthy legal and financial advisors. This forces financial isolation as an almost inevitable starting point. You can't hold internal psychology entirely responsible when this societal structure has deprived them of the necessary external tools to survive that sudden influx of capital.
Let's shift the focus for a second to a psychological trap that really accelerates the loss, and I think demonstrates a failure of self-awareness. I'm referring to the overconfidence bias, or the Midas touch trap. This is a purely internal cognitive error. Success in one specialized field, sports, or music, is mistakenly generalized into supposed mastery in completely unrelated areas, like high-stakes investing or business management.
You mean the classic failed restaurant or the startup investment?
Exactly. They open failing businesses, they try to manage their own portfolios, they back vanity projects. This distortion, it shows a profound failure of self-awareness and personal limit setting. They believe their personal fame somehow overrides basic market principles. This failure to accurately assess personal competence and the belief that money doesn't care how famous you are, it's a classic example of an identity crisis manifesting as catastrophic financial decisions.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the Midas touch trap is purely psychological. It is enabled, and I'd say magnified, by the structural financial error inherent in the very first trap mentioned in the material, the illusion that the money will never stop. This is also known as recency bias.
But how is the illusion of perpetual income more structural than psychological?
Because it's a profound misjudgment of external objective reality in income cycles, particularly in these ephemeral careers. I mean, look at the data. The average NFL career lasts only 3.3 years. The NBA average is 4.5. A newly wealthy individual who has spent their entire life focused on athletic excellence, not financial planning, sees their current $5 million salary and just projects that forward indefinitely.
But that's a failure to model future expectations, which is a psychological blind spot.
It's more than a blind spot. It's an objective financial error that necessitates a specific, immediate structural response. Comprehensive financial planning built around finite income streams and capital preservation. The lavish spending based on this illusion, buying the fleet of cars, the huge house for mom, the constant parties, that's a functional mistake driven by a lack of realism about how long the income will last, and this failure to be realistic about external income cycles. It necessitates a professional structural plan, which critically gets rejected due to that entrenched mistrust of financial professionals. The illusion is the vulnerability, yes, but the refusal to implement an external defense is the structural lethality.
So you see the psychological component, the Midas touch, the illusion, as secondary to the structural failure to build and trust a team that corrects for those blind spots.
I do, because the material itself emphasizes the structural solution. The text summarizes the issue by stating that these people aren't unintelligent or careless, but simply untrained. And that powerfully supports the structural argument. They lack the tools, the expertise, and the essential team. I mean, just as a coach is non-negotiable in professional sports, expert professional guidance is a non-negotiable structural necessity for managing wealth of this scale. You can't solve a structural problem like tax law or diversified investing with self-awareness alone.
That's a compelling argument, and I agree that training and a professional team are essential components of sustainable wealth. However, have you considered that the material ultimately concludes that wealth management isn't simply about professional intelligence, it's fundamentally about self-awareness? Training is rendered completely moot if the subconscious mind, guided by these deeply held money scripts, is actively working against prosperity, constantly seeking to revert to that familiar comfort zone.
But the destruction happens so fast.
It happens fast, because the sudden wealth acts like a psychological earthquake. It violently shakes the very foundation of identity. And structural help cannot fully mend an identity crisis. If the individual is still unconsciously driven by that tribal anxiety, they will hire bad people, they'll fire good people, or they'll actively ignore sound advice just to get back to that financial scarcity. You have to address the internal foundation, the self-awareness, before the external walls of financial defense will truly stand. Otherwise, the failure is simply delayed, not prevented. I see why you emphasize the external drains, the sheer velocity of peer pressure, family demands, and the necessity of a trusted professional team. I mean, those external pressures are undeniable and they must be addressed immediately. However, I maintain that without first exploring and rewiring the underlying money scripts and successfully shifting the financial comfort zone, the individual will just remain vulnerable. They'll continue to create or find new ways to return to financial scarcity, and that renders any structural defenses temporary at best. Lasting financial health, I believe, has to be rooted in a self-esteem that is completely separate from net worth.
And I approach the solution from a different prioritization. While self-awareness is absolutely critical for long-term sustainability and peace of mind, the sheer magnitude and immediacy of external pressures, the relentless demands, the professional isolation, they often bleed the assets dry before the individual has the temporal or psychological space to engage in that deep internal work. For the suddenly wealthy, the priority must be establishing robust external boundaries and a trusted independent team immediately. That structural defense is the primary and fastest protection against immediate financial destruction, giving them the breathing room required to eventually tackle their internal identity issues.
This discussion really illuminates the difficult synergy between internal psychology and external structure. Sudden wealth requires more than just money. It requires both deep psychological wisdom to address the internal chaos and robust external defense mechanisms to survive the immediate relational threats.
Indeed. And the data really forces us to confront whether the crisis is a self-inflicted wound or if it's the inevitable consequence of being structurally unprepared to handle such overwhelming financial pressure. Understanding both elements is essential for building a truly resilient solution.